In the 5th chapter of Peter's first epistle, the Apostle Peter speaks to others who, like him, are pastors, or to use Peter's language, shepherds. People who, like Peter, have been asked by Jesus to tend his sheep, to feed his lambs. And so in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4, Peter refers to Jesus, calling him the chief shepherd. That's a title for Jesus that I'm used to hearing, chief shepherd. I'm also used to hearing the title good shepherd, and perhaps you are too. That title for Jesus comes from John's gospel right after our gospel lesson for today. Our gospel lesson that I just read and talked to the children about from John chapter 10, verses 1 to 10, which is on page 4 of your service folder. That's going to be the text for this message for today. And right after that lesson ended, it ends at verse 10, the very next verse, verse 11, Jesus says, for the first time in the New Testament, I am the good shepherd. About a week ago, I received a phone call from one of the worshipers here at Holy Cross named Jim, who is indigenous to this area of Washington, which is to say his ancestors have been here much, much, much longer than ours. And he called me a little over a week ago to tell me about a YouTube video that he ran across that shares the story of his people as they were living along the Columbia River in the 1930s, about the time that Cooley Dam was being built. And he was excited about this when he ran across this video, and so he shared it with me because, one, it tells the story of his tribe of people, the Spokane tribe, and other Salish-speaking people who were living in that area of Washington at the time. And two, because at the end of this little video, and it was short, only about 6 or 10 minutes, at the end of it, there was a Native American version of Psalm 23. And it was very touching to him to hear that, and he wondered if I had ever heard it before. That Psalm 23, the Native American version, called the Lord the shepherd chief. The chief shepherd, I've heard that before. The good shepherd, I've heard that before. Shepherd chief? Now that was a little different. Let me share that psalm with you. The Native American version of Psalm 23. The great Father above is a shepherd chief. I am his, and with him I will not want. He throws out to me a rope, and the name of the rope is love. And he draws me to where the grass is green and the water is not dangerous. And I eat and lie down, and I'm satisfied. Sometimes my heart is very weak and falls down, but he lifts me up again and draws me into a good road. His name is wonderful. Sometimes, it may be very soon, it may be a long, long time, he will draw me into a valley. It is dark there, but I'll not be afraid. For it is between those mountains that the shepherd Christ will meet me, and the hunger that I have in my heart throughout all this life will be satisfied. Gives me a staff to lean upon. He spreads a table before me with all kinds of food. He puts his hand on my head, and all the tired is gone. My cup he fills till it runs over. What I tell you is true. I'm not lying. These roads that are away ahead will stay with me through this life, and afterwards I will go to live in the great lodge and sit down with the shepherd chief forever. Sharing that with you today because in today's gospel lesson, Jesus began talking to the people of his day for the first time in John's gospel about sheep and shepherds. Jesus said to them, John chapter 10, verse 2, he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. And he is let in by the gatekeeper. And the sheep know his voice. And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he has brought out all who are his own, he goes before them and they follow him because the sheep know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, But they will flee from strangers, for they do not know the voice of strangers. John chapter 10, verses 2 through 5 of our gospel lesson for today. 2 through 5. And then in verse 6, John tells us that he spoke to them using this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was saying. They didn't understand what he was saying. You know, I'm often curious about how biblical imagery comes across in the context of today's culture and today's society. And each year, this biblical image of the Good Shepherd comes back. Fourth Sunday, after celebrating the resurrection, we always have Good Shepherd Sunday, and the texts are always about Jesus as our shepherd. And I'm always thinking about that interplay between that biblical imagery and our context today, because I don't know anything about sheep or about what it takes to be a shepherd. I have no experience with that. I know there are some people here who are in our worshiping community who actually have a lot of experience with sheep. There are some who actually have sheep at home and are tending them in their yards every day. They know something about sheep and shepherds. I think, well, if I just knew more about what it was to be a shepherd or to care for sheep, then maybe I'd have better insight into this passage to be able to preach it to people today. And then I run across verses like John chapter 10, verse 6. Even though he used this figure of speech with them, they did not understand what he was saying to them. And yet, here is a group of people Jesus is speaking to for whom sheep are an everyday part of life, for whom shepherding is a common vocation in their community. It's what many young boys did as their first responsibility in life, their first real job. Maybe like mowing the lawn was, or having a paper route was in my day. That's what it was like for young boys in that day. And yet still, they didn't understand. They didn't make the connection between what Jesus was saying about shepherd and sheep and that shepherd boy who became King David, who wrote a psalm, a prayer, a song to the Lord, the Good Shepherd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in the green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his own name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The people in Jesus' own day did not understand or comprehend what that was about or how it connected to what Jesus was saying. What intrigues me about the Native American version of that psalm that I shared with you just a couple of minutes ago, Psalm 23, is that here's a people for whom their traditional ways of life had no shepherding, no tending of animals, and yet they seem to understand it. In fact, they didn't even know what domestic sheep or cattle were until Northern Europeans brought these animals into their culture. Recently, I read a book for a class. It was a novel by a Native American of the Blackfeet tribe of northern Montana. His name's James Welsh. He wrote a novel called Fool's Crow. And it's an award-winning novel because it develops in a very rich way and an accurate way the culture of the Blackfeet Indian nation before bumping up against the Northern European white settlers who came into Montana. And the whole setting of the novel, called Fool's Crow, is right about that time they were first running into the first Northern European settlers. And it's interesting to read that novel through their eyes and see how odd it was from their perspective to see the way these settlers treated their animals and herded them and corralled them, and to see animals they had never seen before, like domesticated cattle and sheep. It was also interesting to me reading that book to note that the different tribes across Montana had different languages and could not speak to one another. So the Flathead Indians on the west side of Montana, and the Blackfeet Indians in the north central Montana, and the Crow Indians on the eastern side of Montana all spoke different languages. And yet, in the novel, it also revealed that when they interacted with those of other dialects, they had a Native American version of sign language that they use, so that they could interact with people of different tribes who they didn't speak their language. And then to learn that some of that is actually the history behind the Native American version of Psalm 23 as well. Because when missionaries came to the Plains Indians and shared with them Psalm 23, here another group of indigenous North American people who never tended or cared for animals before, but instead they were hunters. They followed the animals where they went. And it was shared with them Psalm 23, but they took it in, and by the Spirit of God seemed to understand what it was saying, and then they began to share it with other tribes of Indians and even other dialects. But they didn't share it orally. Instead, they shared it through Native American Sign Language from one tribe to another. In 1894, there was a Baptist missionary who was living among the Kiowa tribe in Oklahoma who had learned this Native American form of sign language, and she had learned from those Native Americans their version of Psalm 23. And so she translated it back into English, which is the Psalm 23 I shared with you just a couple minutes ago. And there's a lot in that we could talk about. But what struck me first, and what I want to spend the rest of our time today, the few minutes we have together talking about, is the way they called the Lord their shepherd chief. Their shepherd chief. And so I'm going to share with you some things I learned from reading the book Fool's Crow about what it meant in Native American culture to have and live with a chief, and how that relates to who Jesus is, because I think this is a lot of what Jesus is telling us in John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, our gospel lesson for today. So among the Blackfeet Indian nation, to have a chief in your village meant that you had somebody, the chief, whose day in and day out responsibility, whether awake or asleep, was to be concerned for the welfare of his people. And concerned that there were others out there who were trying to steal and thieve and come in and take. And this is what happened between the Native American tribes in this nation. This is what Jesus is talking about in John chapter 10 as well. Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 1, truly, truly, I say to you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but comes in through another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But the one who enters by the door, he is the shepherd of the sheep, and to him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep know his voice. Among the Native American Blackfeet tribes, the chiefs would gather all their people together and listen to their people. Listen to their opinions, their thoughts, their complaints, their hurts. You'd spend a lot of time in patient listening. But then after listening, as they poured out their hearts to him, when the chief spoke, people had such great respect for what the chief had to say that they listened and followed their chief. This is what Jesus is talking about too. John chapter 10, verse 4. The sheep, after he calls them by name and leads them out, after he brings out all of his own sheep, they follow him because the sheep know his voice. And then Jesus goes on to say that a stranger they will not follow. The same was true among the Blackfeet Indian too. The particular village of lone eaters that the book Fool's Crow was about had a chief whose name was Three Bears. And Three Bears was the one they looked to whenever a stranger came into the village from the outside. They were always skeptical of what that stranger had to say. Even if the stranger spoke their own language, They still didn't listen to that stranger unless they turned to Three Bears the chief, and Three Bears approved of what the stranger was saying. Then they knew that they could trust this stranger. This is what Jesus is saying too in John chapter 10, verse 5. Jesus said that the sheep follow the shepherd because they know his voice, but a stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. It's what Jesus is saying in John chapter 10, verse 8. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. That's what he's saying in John chapter 10, verse 10. The thief comes just to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And the people of the Blackfeet Indians understood that too, because that was so much of their life and what was happening between them and the other tribes in Montana, as well as between them and the white settlers that were coming in, and between them and the military of the white settlers that would come. There was a lot of thieving, there was a lot of killing, and there was a lot of destroying. In fact, their name for the white settlers was the Caesars, because they recognized that they came in and took whatever they wanted. Jesus says this is the way it is too, with those who come to steal, to kill, and to destroy. They take, and they take, and they take. But our good shepherd is different. Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 10, they come to steal, to kill, and to destroy. But Jesus said, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And so after the people didn't understand what Jesus was talking about, Jesus switched his metaphor a little bit. And instead of talking about himself as the shepherd and the sheep knowing his voice, he began to talk about himself as the gate. He's the door through which his people, the sheep, could go out and enter into this abundant life. And Jesus also said that anyone who enters through him would be saved. Jesus is the one who gives salvation. You know, the people in Jesus' day may not have understood this figure of speech and what he was saying to them, but it's remarkable to me how much the Native Americans understood about this figure of speech when they compared Jesus the shepherd to their chief. Because their chief, too, would give up his own life for the sake of the people. In the book Fool's Crow, Three Bears, who's the chief of the village, is warned by a physician from the soldier fort about the outbreak of smallpox that was going through all the other Blackfeet villages at the time. And Three Bears was warned that he should take all those who were still healthy in his village and move on to another place and leave the sick behind. But Three Bears isn't willing to do it because Three Bears' way of being a chief for his people was to sacrifice his own life for the sake of the people. And so Three Bears chose to stay with his people. And he died of smallpox right there with his people. And just before he died, he took the red stone pipe and passed it along to one of the other elders in the village, an elder named Rides at the Door, who then became the chief after him. When our shepherd said that anybody who enters through him would be saved, that he came to give life so that we might have it abundantly, he did that by sacrificing himself. Because we too were sick. In fact, everyone was sick. Beside him, everyone was infected, not with smallpox, but with sin, except Jesus. And yet Jesus chose to stay with us anyway. He came here and stayed with us even to the point of giving his own life for us. Except that even after giving his life, Jesus did not have to pass his position on to somebody else because Jesus wasn't just a chief. Our shepherd wasn't just a chief. Our shepherd was also one with the great Father. And so after 3 days, our shepherd rose again from the dead so that we would know that he is the shepherd chief forever. That's how the Native American version of Psalm 23 ends. And I will live with the shepherd chief forever. You know, the people in Jesus' day may not have understood what Jesus was talking about in John chapter 10, verse 6. Sometimes we don't understand what Jesus is talking about in John chapter 10. But today, this message is very simple. It's a message that encourages us to think about what it means to have Jesus as our shepherd. And to think about it maybe in the terms of the First Nations of this country would have thought about it in. What it means that Jesus is our chief. Do I pay enough attention to the voice of my shepherd chief, that even after pouring out all my opinions, all my thoughts, all my complaints, all my wants, all my desires to him in prayer, do I stop and listen to his voice speaking in his word? And do I have enough respect for that voice of my shepherd chief, that with all the things I want to do in this world and the places I want to go, that when he speaks, I will listen to his voice and humbly follow where he goes? And do I have enough trust in my shepherd chief that I learn to discern his voice and the voice of his word from the other voices that are out there, the voice of the one who wants to save and give me a life abundantly from the voice and smooth talk of those who just want to steal and seize and even to destroy? And do I find enough comfort in the words of my shepherd chief, that no matter what challenges or struggles or valleys or darkness I'm going through in life, I'm comforted to know that he gave his life and rose again and is the shepherd king, shepherd chief forever for me? The First Nations people of this country, even though they didn't know one thing about tending or caring for domestic animals, at least had a depth of theological insight to understand this, to connect Jesus as the shepherd with their chiefs of their village. I hope we have that depth of insight too, because Jesus is our shepherd chief. He's our chief shepherd. He's our good shepherd. In Jesus' name, amen.